Hello, friends. Welcome to another lecture. This week we're up to lecture 12, the early Middle Ages in the West. So why don't you go ahead and open up the slideshow presentation if you haven't already. Let's go ahead and open that up. All right, lecture 12, the early Middle Ages. Slide. I want to begin by putting out the terms for this lecture. So if you wish to pause the video, really right off the bat, and take these down, that'll be fine. We'll be going through these. You'll note them as we move through our lecture together. The Constantinian Revolution, Basilica, Charlemagne, Pope Gregory the Great, his works Moralia and Job, the Book of the Pastoral Rule, the Ecumenical Patriarch, Servus Servorum Dei, Augustine of Canterbury, Boniface, Celtic Christianity, Synod of Whitby, St. Aidan, St. Cuthbert, the Holy Isle of Lindisfarne, the Lindisfarne Gospels, and Bede. So if you want to pause the video and take those down, please go ahead. All right, let's keep moving. Slide. There are three parts to our lecture today. One, the Constantinian Revolution. Two, we want to achieve a survey through Charlemagne. And then, thirdly, to have a focus on the figure of Gregory the Great. In fact, Gregory the Great can in many ways be a lens by which we can understand the early Middle Ages in the West, so roughly 500 to roughly 900, that general period. So shifting west now. We were in the east last week. Now we're going to shift back to the west and think about this Constantinian Revolution, where we've got a new political, legal, and social landscape. And what we want to ask is, this is a good entryway, what was the effect of the Constantinian Revolution on Christian prayer life? These are some themes that we began to develop during our intensive week, and I want to look at it a little more carefully now together. Slide. So the basilica, the very root of that word in Greek meaning king, right? Basilica is the location. These are buildings, the location for Christian worship instead of house churches or smaller multi-purpose buildings. We know that Christians were worshiping in spaces set aside specifically for worship. So it's actually a bit romantic to think that they all go out of house churches immediately to the Grand Basilica. There are spaces set aside for pre-Constantinian worship. We have archaeological examples of this. I believe I've spoken with you about the house church of Dura Europos, the space specifically set aside as a baptistry. If not, we'll be talking about that in future lectures. So what we find, though, is Constantine giving over buildings which had been effectively royal law court buildings, basilicas, for the purpose now of Christian worship. So these are large meeting spaces, much, much larger than Christians had enjoyed previously. And again, they were for Roman tribunal courts, but now they're being repurposed. They're being repurposed for Christian worship. What's the effect of that? Slide. The Constantinian Revolution undoubtedly meant stability for the church. This is how many historians have understood the 4th century generally, that, okay, with the conversion of Constantine and his legalizing of Christianity, remember, it's not Constantine that makes it the state religion. He really legalizes it and then officially endorses it as an individual himself. It's the favored religion of the emperor himself. What this means is that Christians now enjoy an unprecedented level of stability. There are lots of theories, though, lots of theories and arguments about worship changing in the 4th century. And these arguments, they're rather old and, as you'll see, outdated arguments. These theories, they hinge on this new stability. So it's beyond question that there's stability, but the question is, how does that stability actually inform, change, shift worship patterns, the day-to-day practical life of Christians? Slide. So here is one of the older theories in brief about how to construe the Constantinian Revolution. I want you to think through this as a thought exercise. The idea was that because Constantine established tolerance for Christians, this meant that Christians, therefore, relaxed their concerns about the imminent return of Christ. So the idea was that prior to this stability, Christians are always on the run, and therefore the imminent return of Christ is always on their mind. So what does that relaxation, if there was one, that's the argument, what does that do for Christian prayer life and liturgical life? So, I mean, the equation is increasing security equals one can plan holidays and other fixed devotional observances, and thus the liturgical year is born, right? So the idea is that the liturgical year is born when Christians can breathe out, okay? And that is a result of, again, the stability offered by Constantine. And note the assumption here. The assumption is that before Constantine, before the Constantinian Revolution, Christians were much more concerned about Christ's return, but not so much afterwards. And you'll even hear this in some sort of sloppy understandings of the institutionalization, this sort of ham-fisted understanding of early Christian history. And that the presence of more elaborate liturgies and more complex calendars that organize the Christian life, the Christian year, the presence of more elaborate liturgies and more complex calendars is being used to confirm this hypothesis. Again, the assumption is that before Constantine, Christians are all about the imminent return of Christ, and that after, he's going to come back sometime in the future. Who knows, right? So that's a big assumption we want to interrogate, right? Slide. This theory and its underlying assumption about the Christian perspective on the imminent return of Christ, this theory actually ignores the evidence we have. Pre-Constantinian Christians actually were concerned with precise dates of events in the life of Jesus, and pre-Constantinian Christians were likewise concerned with establishing a rhythmic prayer life. We have evidence of this. And furthermore, this was not the case in spite of the early Christians' eschatological convictions, that is, that Christ is coming back soon, but actually because of those same eschatological convictions. So we're just speaking about pre-Constantinian Christians. And in point of fact, they did have a very rich liturgical life, and they did want to observe seasons and holidays, feasts and fasts. There is ample evidence that pre-Constantinian Christians used those holidays, used those days and seasons as vehicles for meditation and reflection in order to foster a life of vigilant prayer as they watched for what? For Christ's imminent return, right? So the notion being, the more and more you conform your life to the story of Christ's own life, right, the better position you'll be in to greet the Lord Jesus upon his return, and you will be watchful for his imminent return, that the year itself makes you breathless for his return. So, in other words, feasts, fasts, seasons were not the result of not caring about Christ's imminent return. In fact, it's the other way around. Feasts and fasts and seasons and holidays are, in fact, the fruit of that eschatological imperative. So all that's going on before Constantine's conversion. Slide for us. Notwithstanding, please don't misunderstand me, there was an unmistakable and steep rise in conversions to Christianity during the 4th century. So there's no denying that. There's a steep rise in conversions across the Roman world. Basilicas, these basilicas I've mentioned, they got to be teeming with people, right? And liturgy was spectacular. Liturgy was a spectacle. It was something to behold. It was something to see. It was something to witness. You were curious about what in the world is going on in there, right? In fact, from this moment on, we can actually also start dividing Christian art into liturgical art, which is seen at a distance, Okay, liturgical art, by the way, and this is very important in your liturgical planning, in your pastoral practice as well. When you lead liturgy and when you have liturgical art, it has to be simple and big, right? This is why our gestures are large, like the Laudans position. It's big, right? So everybody can see it at a distance. It's simple and big, right? Whereas devotional art, which is meant to be seen up close, it's not meant to be, part of our public corporate worship. It's meant to be part of more devotional exercises. That can be far more detailed, images with great detail that are meant to be contemplated up close. So please keep that in mind in your own parish ministry in the future and your practice of ministry, that liturgical art is big, right? And actually it should be relatively simple, whereas devotional art can be far more complicated because it's meant to be viewed up close, okay? So perhaps we should, in fact, describe the period of the 4th century, the Constantinian Revolution, really is a moment of transition. I mean, it's undeniable. There's a lot of change going on. But it might be better to think of a Constantinian transition rather than a Constantinian revolution. All right, slide. So let's think more about transitions. First, Christians faced the need to remain countercultural. This is something we know very well, right? The need to remain countercultural, to not be absorbed into pagan culture, or to reflect whole cloth the values and cosmologies, the gut desires, James K. Smith here, of pagan cultures, the heart's desire, right? Secondly, however, flip side, they needed to speak to the culture in a discernible language. This is a core axiom of Christian theology, right? That indeed there is something new in our midst, but it's discernible, right? I mean, you can see that tension in so many areas of the Christian life. The incarnation itself, right? He is of us, but he's not of us all at once, that he's fully God and fully man, that he is fully discernible to us. He speaks to us in a language that we know, right? He shares in our life fully and completely, right? Maybe I shouldn't have said not of us in that respect. So maybe that's not the best way of explaining it. But then he's also fully God, right? So we can see this in our theologies of grace, in fact. We can see this in our theologies of epistemology, how we do theology, how we do mission, right? That in point of fact, we are offering something decidedly new, but it's intelligible. It's intelligible, right? Use that, by the way. Let that be a guiding factor in your missiology as you go out into the mission field, that there is always a tension, right? There's always a tension between what you're offering. You're not hiding out in a basement, right? Right? You have to be intelligible to the culture, but you have to be able to offer something new, right? Or otherwise, you've given away the store. Follow? Okay. So, staying to the 4th century, Christianity, now public and favored, right, was competing with established pagan practices on pagan terms. That's brilliant, isn't it? By devising awe-inspiring rituals in these basilicas. So, pagan rituals had been awe-inspiring, right? They did involve the visual, right? Christians said, yeah, we can do that too. We can compete with pagan practices, right? While offering you the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, right? All right, slide. Moreover, the church could, this is an important facet too. The church could no longer count on the biblical knowledge of Jewish converts. All right, let me stay with that for a second there. Have you ever noticed when you read the book of Acts, right, so many of these Gentile converts that we meet, right, the Ethiopian eunuch. What's the Ethiopian eunuch reading in that chariot? He's reading Isaiah. He's already entered into a Jewish mental framework, right? Cornelius in the book of Acts, he's a proselyte, right? He is already entering into the Jewish furniture, right? The mental furniture of Judaism, right? The cultural furniture to some extent, even. I'm not suggesting be circumcised or anything like that. I mean, go read Galatians, or read the end of Acts too. But what I am suggesting is that in order to fully grasp the Christ movement, in order to fully understand the gospel that the ecclesia is now offering, being immersed in that Jewish Hebrew framework is pretty important, right? Without it, we slip into Marcionitism or Martianism, for example. So the church now in the 4th century cannot count. I mean, it hasn't been able to count on it for a little while now, in fact. The biblical knowledge, the Hebrew Bible knowledge of Jewish converts, nor can the church count on the commitment of earlier Christians who had faced persecution. So that level of commitment that, look, I'm willing to bleed and die for this, right? And you already know I'm sold out, right? You already know I'm sold out for the gospel because I'm willing to die for this, right? So the church can no longer count on the biblical knowledge of Jewish converts or the commitment of Christians during the waves of persecution prior to the 4th century. So it's reductionistic to imagine a total sea change on the one hand, because of its new favored status. Likewise, we can't ignore the fact that there was serious change in the 4th century. Instead, I'm commending to you this model of continuity and change, this model of transition, right? All right, slide. So what I want you to do now is I encourage you to pause the video. Pause the video and can you define basilica for us? Can you speak very briefly on your own or jot down some ideas in your notes about the word basilica? Also, could you explain the Constantinian Revolution? Try explaining it, to your spouse or to someone in your family. Like, what is the Constantinian Revolution? Can you articulate some aspects of the 4th century Constantinian Revolution or Constantinian transition, right? All right, so pause the video and see if you can do that. Okay, if you've come back now, we want to now shift to a survey of early medieval history in the West, okay? Social order in the West, you know this, social order in the West was in steady decline by around the year 400. The empire itself was now divided between a Western emperor in Rome and an Eastern emperor in Constantinople. Rome itself was sacked by northern barbarians in 410 and again in the year 455. 476, though, is the traditional closing date for the Roman Empire. All right, so I mean, this is, by the way, that's great tradition, like date of the fall of Rome, 476, right? Now, there's a lot of arguments that, look, Rome itself was already diminished to a point that we can't speak of it meaningfully for several generations earlier. I mean, this is like the whole debate about, like, when do you actually talk about the end of the Republic and the beginning of the Empire, right, if you were in a Western Civ class. But 476, it's actually part of, that in and of itself has become sort of part of the Western tradition, that 476 is the end of the Roman Empire, at least in the West, right? In the East, it continues in Constantinople, right? But 476 is this traditional date because it's in that year that a barbarian king, Odoacer, deposes the child emperor Romulus, the last of the Roman emperors. There's a fascinating story about that, by the way, that I would love to go into, but we just don't have time for all that. So again, that's sort of Western Civ stuff. 476, fall of the Roman Empire. Slide. So between the fall of Rome, 476, and the coronation of Charlemagne, Charles the Great, Carolus Magnus, between the fall of Rome, 476, and the coronation of Charlemagne on Christmas Day in the year 800, we want to think about the retreating influence of the Eastern Emperor, who's located again in Constantinople, and we want to think about the increasing influence of the Lombard and Frankish kings who converted to Catholic Christianity. Okay, many of them had been Arians to start with. So we want to think, on the one hand, between 476 and 800, we want to remember the decreasing, retreating influence of the Eastern Emperor, who's in Constantinople, and the increasing influence in the West of Lombard and Frankish kings who convert to Catholic, Latin Christianity. Slide. We also want to bear in mind the year 610, in which Muhammad began to receive his revelations in a cave in Arabia. He heard what he thought were bells, and slowly those bells, in his understanding, became a voice, and he understood that voice to be the voice of the angel Gabriel, to which Gabriel said to him bits of wisdom, which were recorded as surahs. Those surahs were then, after Muhammad's life, stitched together to become the Quran, right? So the emergence of Islam in the year 610, traditionally dated the year 610. A century after Muhammad receives his revelations, Islam had swept over the East, covering North Africa, and was powerfully present in Spain, right? So, I mean, it comes fast, okay, after the year 610. Again, tons of stories we could talk about there, but we need to move past Muhammad. Slide. Charlemagne, whose dates are circa 740 to 814. Charlemagne, also known as Carolus Magnus or Charles the Great. He is the king of the Franks. King of the Franks. He poses as a great reviver of the glory of Rome. Again, we're doing this broad brush, skeleton of the period, moving from the fall of Rome, Muhammad, the fall of Christian North Africa, and now we speak about the emergence of Charles the Great, Charlemagne, king of the Franks, and he likes the mantle of old Rome. He wants to revive the glory, the historical memory, and all the cachet that comes with that, of the glory of Rome. And he expands his kingdom to a size not known since, in fact, the old empire had fallen. And he offers a great deal of protection to who? To the Pope down in Rome, who's actually struggling with some Lombards at the time. He offers some protection to the Pope, and he goes and visits Rome at Christmas in the year 800. And on Christmas Day, kneeling at the altar in prayer on Christmas Day, Pope Leo III supposedly surprises Charlemagne by turning from the altar and placing a crown on Charlemagne's head and declaring that he is the Roman emperor, right? Now, by the way, there's a lot of debate about whether this was a surprise or not. One chronicler does affirm that, oh, no, Charlemagne did not know this was going to happen, but, how could you have missed the fact that there was a crown sitting on the altar, right? So there's a lot of debate that goes back and forth about that. The important thing is that Leo the Pope is declaring Charlemagne to be emperor of the Romans, to be the Roman emperor. And this, by the way, is the emerging point for the phenomenon known as the Holy Roman Empire, which, as Voltaire would say centuries and centuries later during the French Enlightenment, that the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, right? It wasn't centered in Rome. It was far from holy. And it was more of a odd, elective, confederated union of sorts. We're going to talk about the Holy Roman Empire through the Middle Ages. It'll always be popping up, and we'll be even talking about it in the next course and when we hit the Reformation. Who is Luther struggling with but the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V? So the origin of the HRE here with Charlemagne, who is crowned when? Christmas Day, year 800. Slide for us. After Charlemagne's death, the Treaty of Verdun in the year 843 divided Charlemagne's empire into 3 sections, which roughly correspond to the portions of Europe we today would describe as Western Europe, Central Europe, and Eastern Europe. By the year 900, it's clear that the lands we know today as France, Italy, Germany, Scandinavia, and England were going their own way as geographical territories, not really nations as we conceive them today. But the point is that these lands were no longer under any unified power, okay? And we're seeing the emergence of medieval monarchies. Slide. So I want you to pause here. I want you to pause the video again here and see if you can identify and comment briefly in your notes on these major dates. By the way, this is how we do chunking, by the way. Otherwise, I'm filling your head up with too much intel. I want you to be able to pause the video and see if you can chunk some of this information, okay? So see if you can, in your notes, identify 476, 610, 800, and 843. Why are those dates relevant in our story? See if you can craft the story. Okay. All right, so if you've come back from pausing the video, if you're coming back now, slide. We want to now focus to the third section of our lecture for this week. I want to focus a bit and see this period, circa 500 to circa 900, through the lens of one critically important figure, a fascinating figure, probably one of the most important figures in the history of Christianity, Pope Gregory I, also known as Gregory the Great, 540 to 604. Gregory's story is a fascinating story. Gregory's story captures several major themes in the story of the early medieval West. One, the crumbling of the Roman Empire. Two, Western monasticism. Three, missionary efforts to the north. And four, the evolution of the papacy, which, by the way, is filling the vacuum of the Roman Empire in so many respects from this period 500 to 900. Slide. Okay, so let's tell the story of this man, Gregory. Gregory, born around the year 540, was a city bureaucrat in his young adulthood. He's a city bureaucrat in Rome, in the city of Rome itself, during the great Lombard invasions of the late 560s. By 574, in his early 30s, he's in his early 30s by 574, Gregory has an experience of conversion. I mean, he's already a Christian, and he sells his inheritance, though. He sells his inheritance, and he comes from a wealthy family. He sells his inheritance, and he founds 6 monasteries in Sicily to the south, and 1 in Rome itself. So he founds 7 monastic houses. This is really amazing. And then he himself enters the one in Rome, right? St. Andrews, okay? By the way, note here that Benedict of Nursia dies just around the same time that Gregory himself is born. So, and do remember from our time together that Benedict of Nursia doesn't invent Western monasticism at all. He's just one of the more classical figures of it, giving the rule, which, by the way, again, we should think of it in terms of early monastic rules as a flexible document, right? It's actually very generous in its sense of balance, right? That we balance work, study, and prayer, right? So Gregory the Great, who becomes a Benedictine monk, again, don't think of Benedictine as a formal order necessarily. He becomes a monk using the rule of St. Benedict really only a couple of generations after Benedict himself. Okay? Slide. So here, by the way, is an image of the current structure of Gregory's monastery. I've been there. Gregory, in fact, used what was his family's own villa. By the way, the image you see there, it wouldn't have looked quite like that. It's been added to, right? But he does begin with his family's villa. Okay, he begins with his own family's villa to form it into a monastery in Rome. Slide. In 578, Gregory is ordained deacon, and remember, we've talked about this, and you know this, that religious clergy are not necessarily ordained. Okay, those who are in under monastic rules are not necessarily in holy orders. Okay, so 578, Gregory though is ordained. He is ordained, and then Pope Pelagius II. By the way, this is not the same Pelagius that Augustine had been, in controversy with. The man just has the same name, okay? Pelagius II, Pope Pelagius II, sends Gregory to the emperor's court in Constantinople as a papal representative. All right, Gregory is very valued by the papacy. His title is Apocrisiarius, right? He's a papal representative to the Eastern court, the court of the emperor in the East. Slide for us. What's interesting is that he never really learns Greek while he's there. Right? He's still fundamentally a Latin speaker and a Latin thinker. He never learns Greek, even though he's an envoy, an ambassador, effectively, a papal representative to the East. And why is he sent there? He's sent there to plead for more support for Italy. He's sent there to say, do not forget your brothers and sisters in the West. Do not forget us. Do not enjoy your stability so well that you forget us in Italy. But while he's there, he's not just there, asking for money. He gets involved in actually a theological controversy. And he came out against the Patriarch of Constantinople, because at this point the Patriarch of Constantinople slipped into a little bit of heresy where he denied the material nature of the resurrection. All right, so there was a big brouhaha, and Gregory waded right into it. He also begins writing his great commentary on the book of Job, the Moralia in Job. He starts writing that in the 580s. So Gregory's quite busy while there ostensibly just to plead for financial and military aid for Italy. Slide. So in 585, Gregory returns home to Rome, and he returns to his home monastery, and he becomes abbot. And what's interesting, by the way, is even though he founds the house, he is not the abbot, right? But when he comes back, he becomes the abbot soon thereafter. By the way, here's an image of the chapel over the site of Gregory's cell. Slide. In 590, Pelagius was dead. Pope Pelagius II. Pelagius II was dead, and the clergy and people of Rome called on Abbot Gregory to succeed him. Right? Not a great surprise. Gregory sets to writing, interestingly enough, a manual for bishops. So now he's pope, and he sets one of his early calls, something he feels convicted to do in this new office he holds, is he feels convicted to write a manual for bishops. The book of the pastoral rule, the Liber Regula Pastoralis. By the way, this is an amazingly helpful discussion of ministry, and I highly encourage you to get your hands on it. There's a wonderful collection. I don't seem to have it on. I've got it in my other office. I actually have two offices. And a wonderful collection of historical texts on pastoral ministry, and it has portions of the Book of the Pastoral Rule. So in the history of what does it mean to be a pastor, we think of Richard Baxter's The Reformed Pastor, for example. Gregory's Book of the Pastoral Rule is a wonderful resource, even for today. I'll be talking about it more in just a bit. Slide. Let's think also about his relationship to the East in the evolution of the papacy. As was custom, Gregory professed his Orthodox faith to the Eastern patriarchs. He wanted. This was the custom that, he is the patriarch of the West, so he makes a declaration to the Eastern patriarchs that, look, I'm holding to the Orthodox Nicene faith. That is customary. That they will recognize him. So he's making his profession of faith. Gregory, by the way, emphatically, and this is fascinating, Gregory emphatically protested claims made by the Patriarch of Constantinople at this time to be ecumenical patriarch. This is a title that the Patriarch of Constantinople had developed for himself, and Gregory saw this as an attempt at universal jurisdiction. And that's probably where there's a bit of a confusion of language. Gregory was translating oikomenikos as ecumenical, as universalis, as universal, as if the Patriarch of Constantinople was claiming to be a universal patriarch. And Gregory had great reservations about any patriarch claiming to be a universal patriarch. Slide. Gregory declared that any bishop claiming to be universal patriarch was a forerunner of Antichrist. That's not Protestant spin. Yes, indeed, one of the greatest popes of the early church, the hinge point actually entering the medieval church, said very clearly that any bishop who claims to be a universal patriarch is a forerunner of Antichrist. Now, while Gregory insisted on the dignity of Rome, Gregory was emphatically pressed his claims as Bishop of Rome and the dignity of Rome. he nevertheless called himself, and this is a title he developed for himself, Servus Servorum Dei, servant of the servants of God. That in fact Scripture speaks of servants, right? So Gregory presents himself as servant of the servants of God, a title still borne by the bishops of Rome. Slide. Now let's talk more about the nature of the Roman papacy. Gregory was regularly approached by bishops in the West with deference about doctrine, and yes, about discipline too. So the other Western bishops in the in Europe, for lack of a better term, in Europe, would approach him as their patriarch with deference. Please, most Reverend Father in God, sit as teacher for us. Right? Remember, the ministry of a bishop is always as a teacher. Beware those bishops who abdicate that responsibility of teaching. Right? But obviously, know who you are when you approach a bishop. Don't take it upon yourself to scold a bishop about that, but know that a bishop's ministry is a ministry of teaching, right? And other bishops would approach Gregory as a higher bishop, as a patriarch, with questions about doctrine and discipline. Please, Most Reverend Father, teach us about doctrine and help us in our disciplinary life. The day-to-day operations, though, were up to local bishops. Gregory was not claiming jurisdiction within these dioceses. The Pope was not in a position either, note this is a big debate during the Council of Trent in the early modern period. The Pope was not in a position to appoint or depose bishops in the papacy of Gregory the Great. Slide. There is, notwithstanding, a sharp, discernible increase in the secular authority of the Pope during Gregory's papacy. Again, we have to keep in mind the erosion of infrastructure in the West, particularly after the invasion of the Lombards. So there's a sharp rise in the secular, for lack of a better word, authority of the papacy. Slide. Here's, by the way, a map showing you where the Lombards are. So you can see the geographical landscape where the Kingdom of the Franks is. Again, this is in the reign of Gregory in the 590s. Slide. Here's an image where you can see Lombard rule during the same time. Again, 590s. Slide. So Gregory set about organizing the defenses of the city. He harbored thousands of refugees. He provided food and water for the city. He even got involved in negotiating a peace with the Lombards in 595 without imperial support. You know, the emperor was, and by the way, the emperor was not pleased with that. The emperor in Constantinople was not pleased with that. But Gregory steps into the vacuum. Okay, and I want you to think about this very carefully. As a pastor, as a figure within a community, do you say, "Oh, I don't get involved in the public square. I keep politics and religion separate"? Well, I think there's some nuance there. You as a pastor, you are concerned about the material needs of your people, right? You are concerned about their safety. You are concerned if they have food. You are concerned if they have clean water. You are concerned if they have safety and security, right? Now, I'm not saying that, pastors should be running for mayor or president or governor or something like that, but I'm simply saying, note how Gregory, as a pastor, isn't simply saying, look, I'm going to teach you something spiritual to the neglect of your material needs. Remember, we believe in God's creation of bodies, and the body is good, though fallen. And in Christ Jesus, we have the redemption of our bodies, and we consecrate our bodies. What do we say in the Rite One Eucharistic prayer? We are a living sacrifice, right? So that means that we are interested in the, to use language common among Roman Catholics, we're interested in human flourishing, right? Slide. So Gregory develops good relations with the Lombard queen and the Visigoth king in Spain, and this likely secured their conversions from Arianism to Catholicism. Don't be afraid to talk with people, particularly political leaders, who might differ from you. find ways of offering Christian charity, recognize a common humanity, be willing to say, hey, I want to talk to you. I want to be in a relationship with you. I'm going to defy the world's thinking, which says if we disagree, we must hate each other. Rather recognize the love of God that's spilling out all over the place, and you want to be in relationship with people, right, who disagree with you, right, in the hopes that they too will know the gospel, the saving gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. Slide. Gregory is also unique in his missionary work. Previous popes had not been involved in missions. That was a new thing for a pope to be involved with. Slide. Gregory saw that missionary efforts also needed structure, though. Right? It's not just wander out there without a plan. Gregory's design was to utilize what he knew, which is, and take that to heart too in your ministry, to use what he knew. And what did Gregory know? Gregory knew monasticism. So Gregory would use monastic headquarters, so to speak, planting them in large cities, and from there being able to send out sub-missionary movements effectively, right? So you'd have a monastic headquarters from which to fan out through what would be known as a diocese. By the way, a diocese is actually a Roman imperial designation. It doesn't begin as a church term. And from there, the Church of Jesus Christ can be involved in social reform, in educational reform, in preaching, and of course the sacramental life of the church would thereby be brought to the barbarian lands, right? And possibly, without doubt, the greatest missionary effort that Gregory inaugurated was that to the British Isles. Slide. The great tale, the great story in the Western tradition is that Pope Gregory, earlier in his life, had seen a number of fair-haired English slaves in Rome, Angles, and was moved to convert the Angles, the English. And supposedly the Pope exclaimed, non angli sed angeli. Non angli sed angeli, which means not Angles, but angels. Non angli sed angeli. Slide. In 596, Augustine needs somebody to head up his missionary effort to England. So who does he choose? Again, what does he know? You think about that in your life. God has not wasted a previous career you had, right? You were being formed. I believe that, right? God does not waste our time, okay? So what does Gregory do? He uses what he knows, and he uses Augustine, right? By the way, that's not to say that, we're just to replicate the post office if you were a postal worker, but there was something you learned, or maybe you learned what not to do, right? Or how to not be a leader, okay? But what does Gregory do? He uses monks. So he goes to his old monastery, the one he formed, and he brings out the prior of the monastery in Rome, Augustine. This is, again, not Augustine of Hippo, just same name, right? 596. He selects Augustine, the prior of his own monastery in Rome. He selects 40 monks to go with him, and he sends them to England to bring Christ to the people who, in Gregory's words, worship wood and rocks. Sending Augustine and these 40 monks to England to bring Christ to those who worship wood and rocks. Slide. By the way, they turned back around. They got down the road a piece, got scared, and ran home. And Gregory said, sorry, guys, you got to go. This is your mission. You have to go, right? And you're going to make sacrifice. And it's going to be sacrifice you feel. Okay. When Augustine does arrive in 597, by the way, Augustine dies in 604. When Augustine arrives in 597, he converts Ethelbert, the king of Kent. England itself is divided among several different kingdoms. Kent is the southern kingdom in the south east. And then what does he do? What does Augustine do? He does what he knows. He forms monasteries. Augustine also established the provinces of York in the north and Canterbury in the south, from which there'd be multiple bishops in dioceses in the province of Canterbury and the province of York. Slide for us. Now, this was actually an unusual move to devise two provinces in a given land, but it was a pattern that was repeated in Germany when the provinces of Utrecht and the province of Utrecht, so the Archbishop of Utrecht and the Archbishop of Mainz, were established by another monk missionary, also sent by a pope, Pope Boniface. Pardon me. Boniface was the missionary, also tapped by a pope, right? So that pattern of two provinces in one land then gets repeated in Germany as well, although it was an unusual move there in the into the 6th century, beginning of the 7th, for Augustine of Canterbury to do that. Slide. So after only 1 year, so to wind back to Augustine's mission, beginning in 597, after only 1 year there, we have evidence Gregory the Great wrote to the Patriarch of Alexandria, exclaiming with joy that 10,000 Angles had been baptized. Right? So after only 1 year, there is enormous conversions going on. Slide. Now, we should note, so immediately let's qualify all that. We should note that Christianity had actually already penetrated England. However, what we refer to, the kinds of Christians up there, we refer to them as Celtic Christians. Celtic Christians. Let's talk a little bit about Celtic Christianity, because you'll hear a lot about Celtic Christianity. I actually had somebody come to our church for a while, dear family, and I wish that they had stayed with us longer. They ended up moving on. Sweet, sweet people. But the mother began to talk to me about Celtic Christianity, and she told me really all manner of things. Number one, that were historically untrue, and secondly, were actually spiritually unhealthy, and I think deeply problematic. Now, I didn't respond to her in a heavy-handed way, but it was important. It's important for you to know when you hear these sorts of things that you have a good grasp of what we're talking about when we talk about Celtic Christianity. Now, the Celtic Christians had certain differences with the more centralized Western church emerging from Rome, Latin Christianity. And there's a lot of romanticism that surrounds it today. But a good example would be the dating of Easter. That's perhaps the obvious one. However, I do want to emphasize to you also that Celtic Christians had certain theological tendencies that led to moralism and, frankly, Pelagianism, the idea of works righteousness. And if you don't believe me, go read the Irish Penitentials, right? The idea being, look, if you feel, you choose. Which would you rather hear when you go to a confessor? You say, I've sinned. One response is, the grace of Jesus Christ is new for you every day. And angels are singing in heaven now because that lost sheep is now found, and grace is free and new every day. And the journey of sanctification is a long one. It involves change. It involves transformation, but God's grace for you is new every day. Or you could hear, you could have done better, and you should have done better, and you need to go stand in the Irish Sea in freezing waters, do damage to your body because you know better. Right? You should trust in your own strength. Right? Go stand in those freezing waters and do penance. Right? As a dear mentor of mine, Father Pei always used to point out, like, if you like Celtic Christianity, you say you like Celtic Christianity, go read the Irish Penitentials. And you see if you don't prefer a rich theology of grace that we find in Paul's writings, as well as the writings of St. Augustine. All right. So in 664, at the Synod of Whitby in Northumbria, though, this is very important to bear in mind, Latin Christians won the argument. In 664 at the Synod of Whitby, British Christians agreed that they would be using recognized customs used throughout the Western world, in other parts of the Christian world. Easter, for example, would be celebrated according to the Roman dating. And here the notion is, we should sacrifice to be in relationship widely? What are the things that we can sacrifice on, right? That might be quite costly in order to be in relationship with one another. And that's something to think about very carefully in the life of the church today. More we could talk about, but we need to keep moving. Slide. So regardless of differences, though, and there are some important differences between Celtic Christianity as well as Latin Christianity. Central to both Celtic Christianity and Latin Christianity was the phenomenon of monasticism. Monasticism. We think here of St. Aidan. So in both traditions, monks are very important. We think here of St. Aidan, who founded a community of monks on the holy island of Lindisfarne in northeast England, which is in turn famed for having St. Cuthbert as its major abbot, and probably also producing, in the early 8th century, the Lindisfarne Gospels, whose beautiful pages still inspire Christians today. We also think of the chronicler, the Venerable Bede, who from his very youth was a monk at Monkwearmouth in northeast England. And what you'll find, though, in the writings of Bede is an intense devotion, right, to the unity of Western Latin Christianity. So we even find folks who have been birthed and reared in the Celtic tradition now fully adopting this notion of being part of something bigger than themselves. That they're in relationship with people who are very different from themselves and now want to strengthen that bond and relationship. So you see that in the writings of Bede. Slide. So as noted, the Holy Isle of Lindisfarne was a community of monks founded by St. Aidan in northeast England. Part of the day, it's an island. However, when the tide goes out, it's a peninsula. So just a bit of a rata for you as you think about Christianity in early medieval England. Slide. Monasteries like the one at Lindisfarne considered much of their vocation, their calling, to be in transcribing and illustrating the Holy Scriptures. Lindisfarne produced a magnificently illustrated gospel book, the Lindisfarne Gospels, and it can be viewed at the British Library in London even to this day. Slide. Okay, I'd like you to pause the video now and see if you can come back, because there's just a little bit more I want to say, but pause the video now and see if you can define these terms from our third part of our lecture for today. Okay, if you're returning now, slide. Okay, I'm going to invite you to pause the video again, and I'd like for you to make an online visit to the British Library in London and see the Lindisfarne Gospels for yourself. Okay? And come back, though. Come back a little bit more. All right, if you're back after making your pilgrimage to the BL, as it's often called, the British Library, slide. So to draw some things together, we've been reflecting on the role monks had in both the conversion of Northern Europe, but more so their organization of the church. All right, we've been stressing that. And we've seen this stem and emerge from Gregory the Great, who was himself a monk and who continued to live as a monk while Pope. So what I would like to do to bring things together close to the end of our lecture for this week is I want to take a step back and reflect closely on just one of his important writings. I've already made mention of it, and that is Gregory's manual of sorts for bishops, the Liber Regula Pastoralis, the book of the pastoral rule, which Gregory wrote really at the very beginning of his pontificate in the year 590. Slide. Gregory's text, and I really want you to think about this in terms of your own ministry. Gregory's text treats three major topics in relation to Christian clergy. One, the suitability of certain persons for ministry. You want to think very carefully in discernment about what are the suitable characteristics of a person for ministry, right? Let's think about that honestly and soberly. Two, the life of a pastor. What is a pastor's life really like? And thirdly, certain complexities of clerical life, right? Certain complexities in clerical life. And at every stage, balance is important. Shock. Wonder where Gregory got that from, right? He gets it from his Benedictine formation. So regarding the first of these areas, Gregory writes that pastoral ministry is an art. It's an art. It's not a science. It's an art. And therefore it must be taught and it must be practiced. Okay? Slide. So as we treat diseases with the utmost care, utilizing the professional physician, Christians must think of the sickness of the soul in the same way. The pastor must therefore function as a physician to the soul. Okay? Naturally, that's going to require both education, right, what you're doing now, and maturity. Right? I can tell you that I'm creeping up on a decade in holy orders, just shy of that, and I'm not the priest I was even 3 or 4 years ago, and definitely when I was first ordained. It takes a long time to continually grow in ministry, even though a priest is a priest is a priest is a priest. And by the way, again, I don't want to assume that all of you are being formed for the priesthood. And this what Gregory has to say is actually applicable far beyond the priesthood as well. I do want to underline that. Don't check out if you're not being formed for that, and nor think of this as only the providence of the priesthood. So it does require, pastoral ministry does require both education and maturity. Time in study and time in practice are complementary, and neither can be shortchanged. Do not think, I want to rush through my theological education just so I can get on to the practice, right, of ministry. That's the real stuff, right? Otherwise, we're going to have theologically deficient clergy. And let me tell you, you can see the fruit of that now, right? Vice versa, we don't want clergy who have no experience of holding somebody's hand while they die, right? We don't want clergy only engaged in study. We want people who know how to counsel somebody before they're married. We want folks who know how to prepare someone for baptism. We want to know, we want our clergy to be able to talk to a couple as they're looking hard at divorce, right? We want clergy who have those formational experiences. These are the marks of one suited for ministry. Okay, slide. The second area Gregory discusses is related to the first, and that concerns the daily round of the pastor's life. He must be pure in thought and exemplary in conduct. That means that even when your people don't see you, right, you need to be concerned about the person you are always being formed to be by the power of the Holy Spirit. Do you attend to prayer even when nobody's looking? Right? Do you attend to prayer even when no one's looking? The internal spiritual life is directly related to the active life. A clear heart and a clear mind will harmonize with a clear life. And we're learning more and more and more about that, by the way, in neuroscience. In fact, how our brains are formed. Okay, what you spend time doing outside of 9 to 5. And by the way, your ministry will hardly be 9 to 5. I fear for the pastor. I'm not saying you don't take Sabbath time, right? And you don't mark out time for your family and for yourself, right? Even when the church might need you. No. That's unhealthy too. But thinking that you can just clock in and clock out, that's deeply unhealthy as well. That's not ministry. That's punching a card. Okay. Notice, by the way, that being a spiritual doctor, being a physician of souls, means with humility that you do know a lot. Again, let me give you an example that clergy do wrestle with, and you're going to have to wrestle with this, is do you know or not know what your people pledge? There's great arguments back and forth. That's something to think about. If it is a spiritual area, which I assure you, money is a major spiritual area, right? There are very good arguments to know what your people pledge. There are also very good arguments to not know. What I'm trying to do is get you to think about that. And what is your role, not as just an administrator of an institution called a parish, right? But what is your role as a spiritual physician? And how do you carry that charitably, discreetly, and with humility as a sinner yourself? All right? Slide. So as a pastor, Gregory writes, a pastor has to attend to the pursuit of holiness. You have to be engaged in holiness of life yourself. The life and conduct of a pastor will affect the quality of his ministry. All right? There is a characteristic axiom, often heard at Nashotah House. Our people will never aim higher than their clergy. Our people will never, and I have seen it up close and personal. Right? If you yourself are not engaged, if the rector is himself not engaged, or herself is not engaged in daily prayer, weekly service, right, to others, care for the poor, is not engaged in biblical study, then why in the world would our people be engaged in prayer and seeking after holiness? Right? Yes, our clergy, our people need their clergy to be didactic pastor teachers. Yes, they do. But we also need to see our clergy and our ministry leaders as models for discipleship. And if you don't believe me, go look at the vows that deacons, priests, and bishops take to conform their families and households as models, right? And that's a big thing to think about, particularly for spouses and for children too, right? Why do I need to bring my kids to Sunday school? Rector doesn't send his kids to Sunday school. Why do I need to send my kids to Sunday school? Right? I bring them to worship, that's enough. Think about that very carefully. Now, how do you conform your household? How do you do that gently and gradually? And how does that happen when you enter in discernment as a family, right? And all we're talking about is basic discipleship. Every Christian is called the holiness of life. Every Christian is called the holiness of life. So a pastor cannot short circuit that in his or her own life. A ministry leader can't short circuit that. So clergy by their life and conduct witness to the world what it means to follow Jesus publicly, right? Therefore, don't be afraid, don't brag, but don't be afraid to say, yes, I pray the office every morning, right? And here's a simple way you can start praying the office. Let me tell you the joys that I have from daily prayer, that sort of thing. Therefore, our people must know their clergy to be men and women of deep, careful, and reflective prayer. Every priest and deacon, especially, must have a rule of prayer, and you need to be able to explain it, right? And remember, chief rule of ascetical theology, you have a rule that you can actually keep. Developing a rule, well, I'm going to pray seven monastic hours, and I'm going to pray the rosary every day, and I'm going to go hear mass every day. Develop a rule you can keep, and then keep it. Okay, and don't be afraid if you fall down on your rule. You can start it every day. Right? Let me also make an aside here. I have found just a voice as somebody attending to holiness of life. Recently, I've found, and I say this actually even from not just an Anglo-Catholic perspective, but I say this from a Reformed Protestant perspective as well. I have recently re-engaged the discipline of weekly confession into my own life. And simply to be honest, and I have found it to be a remarkable aid in my life. Remember, in Anglicanism, auricular confession, the general informal byline is all can, none must, some should. Well, if auricular confession isn't part of your discipline, your rule, fine. I'm simply sharing with you that of late I've found weekly auricular confession to be extremely helpful. And that's just recent in my own life as a Christian. I've made confession in the past, but just in the past several months, I've reawakened the need, not as some fussy Anglo-Catholic thing, but really to weekly face into my sins and to face into my need for grace and to hear that word of grace and to know and trust the power of grace in my life, spoken by a minister of the gospel. That Luther has this wonderful way of putting it that when the minister declares, right, the words of grace, that's the mouth of Christ speaking, right? You can find no better articulation of priesthood as in persona Christi than that, and you can find it from Martin Luther himself. So just something to commend to you. I'd like to share with you as a brother seeking after holiness. Slide. So regarding that third area, the complexities of the work of the pastor, Gregory advises that a good teacher knows where his disciples need to go, what they need for the journey, and how to equip each individual in a way that is unique and effective. Okay. So again, this is where, thinking about like money, just for example, right? Like, do I know my people? And that begins with making relationships with them, right? Not coming in as an inquisitor, right? But really deeply being in relationship with them. Have you been in their homes? Have they been in your home, right? Again, boundaries. You need to remember boundaries. But be in relationship. Be in real meaningful relationship. Not 9 to 5, hello, how are you? But real meaningful relationship. So that you can then act as a spiritual doctor, a spiritual physician for them, and carry that mantle lightly and humbly and as a sinner yourself. So the task of discipleship from the pastor's perspective has to tend to the needs of the individual. People grow in different ways, but always into the same full stature of Christ, Ephesians 4:12. We are growing into the full stature of Christ. God's singular love then has to be communicated through a variety of media, as it were, right? What works for one person might not work for another person, but in the end, we're all growing into the same full stature of Christ. Slide. So Gregory's influence, it looms large through the early Middle Ages. Many other angles that we could discuss. We could talk about his liturgical work, including Gregorian chant, or the exchanges that he had with Greek theologians. Among Eastern Christians, Gregory the Great is actually known as Gregory Dialogus for his dialogues. But let's offer a big picture summary. There's a lot more we could talk about Gregory, but let's offer a big picture summary. What I want you to see is the early Middle Ages as a time when monks filed through Northern Europe, organizing and administering a missionary program and bringing a measure of unity, too, to Catholic Europe. Don't forget the Synod of Whitby and the Celtic Christians. So what we're seeing is monks fanning out, organizing, administering, missionizing, and also bringing unity, right? Not under a subjugating Roman Pope, yet at least, but in a measure of unity across Latin Christianity. Slide. Okay, so here's just a concluding review for us. We've done several smaller reviews, chunks throughout our lecture. So here's just a final review for you. Can you summarize Gregory's ideas in the Book of the Pastoral Rule? How would you quickly summarize Gregory's ideas in the Book of the Pastoral Rule? And then, after you've written a very short summary of your own, look back over your term definitions that you've made in this lecture, and see what connections you might be able to draw among them. See how these chunks are related. Could you describe, for example, a basic outline of this period as for a member of your congregation? So if somebody were to approach you and say, tell me about the early Middle Ages, what are some of the things that you would outline for them? So with that, I leave you to your review. And again, please always know that I am here for you. Again, I strive for a one-day turnaround with email. Always be patient with me, as I'll be patient with you. But we do hold each other accountable. Email is always the best way to get a hold of me, but you're always welcome to call, or we can arrange a Skype visit. So, God's rich blessings for you this week. You guys are always in my prayers.